think we're going to just jump right in, right?
Yeah.
And if people can keep admitting people, that'll be super cool. And thank you. And I am going to, I've got a brief introduction here that we're going to kick off with. So let's go. So greetings, everyone. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And let's dive in. This is the second year architecture studio at Texas Tech University. And we're really excited to be here. And we are even more excited that Terry and Joe Harvey Allen are in the house with us tonight. We're looking forward to today, not quite night. We also have a bunch of guests in the house, ranging from Andy Wilkinson and Caitlin Dixon from the archive to Brendan Greaves from the record label, Paradise of Bachelors, and our guest critics and lots of other people. So super excited to have everybody here, as well as all of the students. The second year faculty, the teaching cohort this semester has been Dr. Hendrika Bulix, Brian Bowie, Lucas Hitch, Yvonne Iturregi, Dr. Lisa Lim, Ben Chaput, Jeremy Wahlberg, and myself. And I also just need to start by thanking everybody for being here and acknowledge and doing all that you're doing to help us make our way through the fog of this present situation. And we're grateful for all of that. And so the first piece of the puzzle for this course is Phase Forever, that goes on forever. And it's keeping us in the kind of social space and getting us into this moment. We kicked off the semester with Phase 1, our analytical difference engine, where we began with Lubbock County and examined the grid as an abstract and concrete construction. We then jumped to Phase 2, the pit pile mapping, where we jumped into volume using open pit mines across North America. And that helped us dissect volumetric relationships. Phase 3, jam the drive-in. We introduced the mechanics of optical and acoustic geometries of perception and the car and potentially scary things. Our site, it was in Lubbock in Mackenzie Park, a site containing a great many forces, histories, happenings, and people. And Phase 3 manifests mostly in the wood shop. This happened before spring break when we were still on campus, and happened through what we call rib grid models, so very much physical modeling. And then Phase 4, we tune the archive. Here we continued the momentum of the prior phases, trying to bring them together while also introducing the archive of the Allen collection into the drive-in, inserting the archive into the drive-in. And that brought in everything that the archive contains. A central emerging effort, force for this is something that comes from Terry and Joe Harvey, and the desire to activate both the material, the legacies, and this place. And so the drive-in is a very dynamic situation. And I'm gonna now just swing through some stuff, some projects real quick. So we have those in front of us. Terry and Joe Harvey asked to see some of those, and these are from some different sections, and to give a sense of where the modeling effort has come to be in this stage of Phase 4. We can refer back to these if productive, but I think mostly we're going to kind of jump off and kind of make the archive live through conversation. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop the share screen, and we'll jump into welcoming Terry and Joe Harvey, and let's talk about this archive and the grooviness that it embodies.
Well, there's something kind of perfect about connecting our archive with a drive-in movie theater. Just because I know that you have some kind of syllabus where that you're working on that kind of idea, but they were definitely our laboratories of work when we were in high school. And we spent a lot of time in automobiles at drive-ins. And I think it's also kind of appropriate now, especially appropriate now with the social distancing. It was kind of an irony, I guess, or kind of a contradiction, because you have all these cars separated from one another with all these people crammed inside, very little social distance going on there. And but we grew up around drive-in theaters from the time we were little kids. And I can remember my folks when they would hear about a movie somewhere in Carlsbad, and we'd get up like Saturday morning really early. My mother would fry chicken and make a big picnic thing and get in the car and drive to Carlsbad and go to a drive-in, and they would watch that movie that they'd heard about. Then after it was over, we'd drive back to Lubbock. And there was never a thought about distances or crossing space or any of that stuff. So, but I know it was a pivotal thing, I think, a lot for Joe Harvey and I both, probably in our childhood, because drive-in movie theater were also kind of a recreation area for kids, was always right under the screen. So you went about an hour before sunset and you went out and, with all these other kids from all these other cars, most of them you didn't know, and played for about an hour until a sign would come up on the drive-in and say, "Return to your car, the movie is about to start." And so we'd all kind of play to the last minute and then go sit and wait for the movie, because they always started a little bit too, before the sunset. So it was you kind of basically looking at a white screen with sound, for about the first 30 minutes.
The drive-in is actually responsible for Terry and I's 57 years together, because we'd been friends since we were 11, but until we went to the drive-in together, we weren't boyfriend and girlfriend.
Yeah, things changed.
Our first kiss.
Lots of things can happen in.
Yeah, there used to be a lot of drive-ins in Lubbock. There was the Sunset, which was out at the end of 34th Street. There was the Trail, which was out on Idlew Road, I think. The Circle, which was south of town on Q. The Circle was interesting because they built a big motel right behind the Circle, and at one point it turned into a porno theater. And so a lot of people were, booking rooms in that motel because you could sit out on the balcony and watch a porno movie. It was silent, but the sound wasn't a huge issue. And then there was a Red Raider, and Andy, I think, wasn't the Golden Horseshoe? Wasn't it didn't it become the Red Raider?
No, the Red Raider was on North University.
Where was the Golden Horseshoe?
Horseshoe was on South University, and it was a double screen, which had the added advantage of on top of the concession stand, they had like a patio dining experience where you could go and sit at a table and watch either screen. The Red Raider, you'll remember, had a Red Raider going through the line carrying a football. And then after E.J. Holub made All-American, and he was a center, they still nevertheless painted the number on the jersey of the ball carrier to number 55 for E.J. Holub. So I don't know if you remember that or not, but
I don't remember that. I was gone. I was gone when that happened.
It was a big event in Lubbock history.
Yeah.
Repainting the number.
Drive-ins came back for a while, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was at least 20 years ago, because in Austin, I know we'd drive to Wimberley and sit out on the lawn and watch drive-ins, and a lot of people were doing that all over the place then.
Yeah, just setting up, putting
And a
on.
thing
Yeah.
for a short time. I think when they were able to do the big screens outside.
We may be fixing for a comeback of drive-in, given that we're all going to be living in our bubbles for a little while.
Actually, we have a friend who owns movie theaters, and he is building an outdoor drive-in theater right now
Because of the current situation.
in Santa Fe. Yeah.
Wow. Joe Harvey, given your the depth of history and specialization in the theater, it'd be a thing that we've been referring to the archive as a performative archive, as rather than like a static archive that's just sitting hermetic. I'd be curious to just hear your thoughts about performance relative to archival material and the opportunities for that, or just how performance is contained in an archive, or to me, there's a whole bunch of questions there about the relationship between performance and archiving.
One thing that's documented in my notes is the beginning of different plays. And plays come from one play I did started because of loving the sound of a baseball game. I didn't know anything about baseball, but I developed Home Run based on that. I thought that was the sound of the American dream. So you see that in the archives, that struggle to put that piece together, not knowing where it was going or why, based on nothing but the sound. And then in a play called Duck Blind, it started with 2 drawings because I had had quite a few studies at the beginning in wanting to be an interior designer. And so that particular play started with drawings of 2 rooms, mine and Terry's bedroom and our 2 sons, Buck and Bale, when they were little, their bedroom. So you see all these different ways. Another play, you see the beginnings of it from a failed interview with Waylon Jennings, and how Terry said to me, "You don't always have to interview someone famous." And I went to a waitress's home, and that began that whole process. So all of that is documented in the archives. Not only that, all the interviews with the waitresses from, you know, it must have been 40 years ago, are in the archives, which are really amazing documents of history and time, especially in the women's movement and what was happening at that time. So there's various ways that you can see how plays are put together, or performances are made, or stand-up is pieced together. And you can also, I thought it might be interesting, 2 different ideas. One was recent, where I'd taken, I have a play that I did. Now it's moved to storytelling, and where I pretend to be reading, but part of it is memorized. So I go off and then do stand up and then come back to the little book reading. But I wanted to incorporate music because there was always the lyrics inserted or the music taped in the play, but I thought to put live music, and I was hoping to come to Tech with the theater department and show one little section of the play where I worked out that process to see how it worked of adding music, live music, to the performances, and integrating that where it had always been taped before. But the other thing is that students who were interested, I know students at UT have done Counter Angel. They've used parts of it for monologues when they're practicing monologue, because there were one-woman shows. So there's ways that those plays could be redone by students. They've got the whole play there, and they've got videos and everything of the play.
Fantastic. What questions are out there in this room to bring to Joe Harvey and Terry? There's so much opportunity here. What do we have, people?
I think one thing that intrigues me is the variety of collected work. I haven't seen any of it, but if maybe you could talk about some of the collection and the pieces that are in there. It's really interesting to hear Joe Harvey talk about this play. And I think the students would love to hear more about what the collection entails. As an
Well,
artist and designer, it's really interesting to me, this collection.
It's about, you know, in some cases, it goes back 60 years of like notebooks, sketchbooks, diaries, journals. I've always kept, since I was in junior high, I always kept a notebook. And due to this day, where that I always kind of thought from early on that it was important somehow to get something out of your head into on paper where that you could look at it. And so there's a huge collection of like those notebooks, I guess about 300 or so. I don't know exactly the number. And then there's songbooks of lyrics, of books that where I've worked on song lyrics. But the thing is, there's drawings in the songbooks, there's lyrics in the journals. But it's kind of basically like giving Texas Tech your life. You know, that's kind of what both of us did. I was really glad to get rid of it. Joe Harvey had it a lot harder. I was glad to get rid of it because I had a flood in my studio and lost, like, you know, quite a few of those notebooks and whatever. So I was always paranoid when I would leave and afraid the pipe would break or something, some fire would. But so it became, you know, kind of a well-intended storage for me. You know, I was really happy to give it over to Caitlin and let her kind of start messing with it. But one thing about it too, it's got videos of working videos of things that we've done, either pieces that were actual video pieces and how they kind of came about, work tapes, audio tapes, a lot of cassettes, a lot of, you know, the videos are all VHS and so it's things that is kind of, as soon as they went to the archives, they had to be digitalized, and there were a lot of them. So that's the one thing you might have about an archive. I think you might have one book or one tape or whatever, but you have you know, maybe 5 years or so of ideas and possibilities and things that you put into that like Joe Harvey saying, just maybe some little sentence that you wrote or whatever, where that things, you know, kind of catapulted from, became a piece. And I think that's the great value really of an archive, is that you see how the first kind of ideas and plans of things that eventually get developed into, you know, something, either something larger or something totally different, you know. I know, you know, a lot of times I found myself, I would be working diligently on one thing, but find out maybe, you know, a month later, or with one thing or one incident that I'm dealing with in the book, that I was really working on something entirely different, you know. And I think that's the value kind of having that device right next to you. I find this incredibly weird to talk to postage stamps like this. You know?
I think that's a natural human response. So that's a good sign. But we are all kind of working our way through the postage stamp or the interface as best we can.
Yeah, I know. You know, it's like really seems like this social distancing and all of this stuff that's going on now I think we were talking about the other day, it's really the coup de grace of the tactile age, you know, because, you know, it was ending pretty fast anyway with, yeah, you know, with just the way people view, listen to music, the way they view art, whatever. I still think it's nice to walk through a museum instead of having a virtual tour, you know. I'm not big on virtual tours, but also, you know, I think back about like when I was teaching, like at Fresno State in the early 70s. It's like small places didn't have access to actual work, you know. I know there was a movement at one point to take trucks around with art, and they would stop at different places, and people would, you know, could look at real art.
Truckloads art, you mean?
Yeah, but so everybody had a copy of Art Forum or Art in America or one of these art magazines. Kind of the students, the influences were much more from those magazines than from actual ever seen work, because they never saw any real work. So that became the thing that influenced the making of work. So you know, it's like a you know, a whole culture that came from reproductions, you know, piled upon reproduction, piled upon reproductions. And whereas I think that's one of the things that's interesting about music is like when you play music live, it's one thing, but when you make a record, you're actually making the work, you know. You're like when you're playing it live, it's a performance, but when you're as an object, you're making a record or a CD or whatever. And I always liked that idea of holding it, you know. And that seems to have been, with the exception of like people like Brendan, who's sitting in on our meeting, who's Paradise of Bachelors, my record label, is the big resurgence in LPs and I guess minimally CDs, but the real interest is an LP. And I miss it. It's kind of like a drive-in thing, you know. Because of the scale, you know. I miss that, having a square foot to look at, and I remember when you got a record, it was an event. You know, you bought a record, you played it, you read the lyrics, you went through the, you know, you looked, but it was a real actual event, it kind of in your life, and went and played certain songs over and over. But and you also had a continuity to work with. You had a side A and a side B, so you could kind of plot how the songs went, how they fell, and that kind of ended with CDs and tapes. But at least you still had the beginning to the end that you could work with. You know, you still worked with a thing, making it one thing. And then when the digital thing came, that ended, I think, because it became about just hunt and pick the song or whatever. And so that kind of continuity that I think to me, you strive for and make when you make a record or when you make anything, disappeared. How do y'all feel about that? Do you know?
It's a really good question. I mean, the physicality versus the immateriality. What, I'm talking too much. What are other people weigh in here? David Greger from New Orleans. You've got something to say about physicality.
Can you hear me, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here, Terry, here's one for you.
Where are you, David? Which one are you?
I'm the one holding up the album.
Yeah. The Al's Cafe.
Yeah, which Al signed for my friend Michael Gruber, who went to that a couple years ago out in LA. Yeah. They redid Al's Grand Hotel. So, yeah. Hey, I have a question for you, because I mean, I miss albums too, but I'm a forward-oriented person, so I embrace the CD, and now I like it even better that I can get anything I want to listen to anywhere. So, so I have a question here. I think part of an archive, what it misses is it has your work, it has both of your work, but I'm wondering, what about the people that you brush into throughout your career and your lives that I don't know how they're going to be incorporated into the archive. So here's my example. If I ask Joe Harvey, and it has to do with 2 Daves and 1 Lowell. So what was it like, and what was the influence of meeting David Byrne? And maybe for you, Terry, Dave Hickey, what role did he have in really in both of your developments? And then my last question is kind of a personal one, because
He was a high. I'm sorry.
The last one is because it's how I found your music, was through Lowell George. So those are 3 people who I think have been part of your lives, and I'm wondering well, first of all, just if you could just say something about each one of them, and then maybe answer the question of how do they get incorporated into everyone else's knowledge once it gets into an archive.
Should I start with David?
Yeah.
Oh, David, I was asked to do my first film with David Byrne, the film called True Stories. And just working with David was such an influence because of his generosity. He was so generous in letting me write a lot of my own scenes. And he also would allow me to come and look through the camera at a lot of shots. And then we had lunch together every day, and we would talk about the movie and look at his storyboards. And I just felt so, it was just a fabulous first experience with a director. And then David started playing Terry's Juarez. I think that's practically all he listened to while we were filming True Stories. And then David called and said, "What are you doing for New Year's?" He hadn't met Terry yet. And, but he had asked Terry to write a song with him for True Stories, which Terry did, because he loved Terry's music. And I think he asked if they could come for New Year's. We said we were at home for New Year's in Fresno. So he and his wife, Adele Lutz, came and spent New Year's with us in Fresno. And we just became really close friends and godparents to their daughter, Malou. But it has been an ongoing relationship. He and Terry have worked together, trying to get Juarez into a play and writing songs, and they spend a lot of holidays with us. And so it's just been a real open kind of, he has been so generous in including us in things and helping us. He just played on one of Terry's concerts not long ago. And so that kind of relationship is documented all the way through with letters and everything in the archives, as well as people, all the artists. We used to write letters because we couldn't afford to actually call. So for years, we wrote very long letters to people, and that's something that is gone practically. But we had hundreds and hundreds of letters between artists and writers, and those are all in the archives. And we were all struggling and learning and working, and we all shared our ideas and what we were trying to accomplish. So those are really, I think,
the letters
are archives. Yeah.
The letters are a huge kind of answer to what you're asking.
Right.
Because it's like Joe Harvey was saying, when we were young, we had absolutely no money. And the way you communicated with friends is you wrote letters, because calling them on the phone was outrageously expensive if you had no money. And so people wrote very long, detailed letters about what they were working on, what was going on with their lives and so forth. And like when David and I were working on, we were going to do a music theater piece of Juarez. We did it all, we did our writing on put it on the wall, but then all of the text would run it through, make copies through a fax machine. All of our conversations were through faxes. And that's another thing, you know, must have correspondence that deep of faxes of just with David. I've got a lot of different musicians, Guy Clark. I have a lot of faxes with Guy. And faxes were, you know, unfortunately disappeared because of the ink, and so you had to kind of keep them in the dark. And that's one of the things that Caitlin's been having to deal with, I think, with the archives. But it was really, there was a steady communication. Like Al Ruppersberg and I had, you know, massive correspondence with each other because we went to school together. We met in school and are still very close friends. Lowell George, I met through a guy named Doug Edge, who at a party in Los Angeles, and there's not that much documentation with Lowell, but
so you didn't know Lowell from Texas?
No, I met Lowell in L.A.
Okay.
When
what year would that have been?
We lived in L.A. all the 60s. I met Lowell probably 69. Something like that. When it was right before their first Little Feat album, because they were rehearsing and working in a warehouse putting together that first record, and he had heard he had heard Juarez and was interested. Maybe he had heard tapes of it. Juarez wasn't even out at that time. It didn't come out actually till '75. But I had been sending tapes of songs of different songs from Juarez, and he wanted to produce it. That was initially how we met. And I jammed with them, and they heard my song New Delhi Freight Train, which down the line they ended up doing. But that most of my connection with Lowell had to do with cassettes. It's like same with David. I've got, you know, I don't know, you know, probably 50 or 60 cassettes of just work tapes of David's.
Those are at Tech. Those are at Tech.
Yeah, they all went to these archives. So like I know when David, when he first contacted me about doing a song for True Stories, he sent me the music, and he writes so radically different from the way I think about writing. But what he would do is he used his voice, the sound of his voice, like an Arab yodel as an instrument. He would, you know, just be an addition to whatever what the tune was. And I remember it was called Blue Gallop, and I couldn't make heads or tails. And he wanted me to put words where this bizarre Arabic yodeling was going on, and which I basically, you know, kind of took part of the tune and then rewrote it and did my own song, which, you know, worked out fine. But that's pretty much documented. There's letters talking about it. There's, you know, and so it's there. It's very much there. In fact, it's probably the heart of the archive as much as anything.
And how about Dave Hickey? How did you meet Dave?
I met Dave he married a woman we went to high school with. Turns out Dave's Joe Harvey's about third or fourth cousin. And they were great friends until they found out they were kin to each other, you know. And then
Yeah, we fight a lot. Dave loves to devil me.
Yeah, but
he used to call me Joe Harvey.
He was doing he was curating a show. He had a gallery in Austin, one of the first contemporary galleries in Austin, called A Clean, Well Lighted Place. Right. And he had been asked to curate a show for, I think, for a museum in San Antonio called Sweet South Texas Funk. And he had seen some of my work when we were in California. We'd moved to Lubbock for about 5 months, and I had a studio out on Idlew Road. And Dave called and asked if he'd come and look at some work. And so he did. He came to my studio, and it was a huge howling sandstorm, I remember. And I noticed when he pulled up that he had a guitar in the back seat of his car. And, I asked him if, he played music. He said, yeah, I write songs. And so he brought the guitar in, and he looked maybe 10 minutes, picked a couple of drawings, but then the rest of the day we spent just playing music, playing songs for each other. And so I really knew Dave originally as a songwriter. And we both have had our first cuts on another person's record with Bobby Bare because of Dave. Dave had a tape of my songs, and he was snowed in. He was writing an article, I think, for Penthouse or Playboy or something, but he was on this package tour with Bobby Bare, and they got snowed in somewhere like Kansas City, and Dave played him the tapes. And so he picked 2 of my songs and 2 of Dave's songs and put them on his record. So, my situation with Dave has always been kind of not so much about the art world, even though he's probably wrote more extensively about my work than anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about this project, Joe Harvey and Terry. When I heard about the project for this studio to marry an archive and a drive-in theater and a performance space, it made me think of the surrealist line of something being as beautiful as the chance encounter between an umbrella and a sewing machine on an operating table. So I wondered kind of what you two were inspired to imagine with the premise of this studio. How could your archive and a drive-in theater and a performance space come together? And then I was thinking, when you were talking about buying a record being an event, how when an archive is full of records, so it's full of potential events. So maybe
can I just, one thing that I thought about when you were talking about this is that right after True Stories, right at the closing party, I had a conversation with David, and he asked if I would join him and Spalding Gray and the Talking Heads to go on tour in drive-ins across the country.
Awesome.
His idea was that after the movie True Stories and after Jonathan Demme's movie with David, that they had to be more than 4 stick figures up there, the Talking Heads. They had to do more of a show. And his idea at that time was to do it in drive-in theaters across the country. And already those were sort of falling apart, but there were still a few in every town standing. And so he presented the idea to the rest of the group, the Talking Heads, and I don't think they liked that idea, and so it never happened. But I think he wanted Spalding and I to be the sort of the MCs at the drive-ins. I don't know, but anyway, I thought of that in connection with performance.
Yeah. That's
I
fantastic.
think it was a 2-dimensional thing where you would actually have the stage and you would have the movie. And then Terry, talk about your drive-in where they stepped out of the theater piece.
I guess drive-ins were in the air because I did a soundtrack for a dance called Pedal Steel with Margaret Jenkins' dance company in San Francisco. And it was based on the kind of legend of Billy the Kid, but also a pedal steel player that I'd heard a lot about, one of the first pedal steel players that had played rock and roll, a guy named Wayne Gailey. And they wanted me to do the music and the sets and the costumes for this piece. And so I decided to make the set just a large drive-in theater with a stage at the bottom of the screen, a stage in back and a stage in front. And it had a double rear projection screen so that the dancers that were doing the piece could dance in front of the screen, but they could also in silhouette dance behind the screen. They could kind of interplay with one another. And one of the ideas that's talked about in the piece is ghosts of sitting and watching. And the piece was called, the drive-in was called The Beauty. In the actual performance, the beauty is a neon that's backwards, like you're behind behind the screen. But was an idea that this movie played and figures came out and performed and lived their lives and then went back into the screen, kind of like the Maldoror, what you're talking about, the surrealist quote. But I think there was always that fascination. It's called the abandoned beauty because drive-ins at that time were being abandoned all over the United States. It was just kind of ending. But there was a great kind of romantic nostalgia always connected with that as far as the past, and which is another thing that an archive is. So it makes, total sense in a way to have an archive be a drive-in movie theater with a performing space, and wherever the camera is, you could put all those journals, I suppose, wherever the projector is.
Another idea.
Cars,
Another idea is all of the stories that are in real time in each car. Mm-hmm. If there was some way that you could project the sounds or the partial conversations from the cars onto, the screen somewhat. I mean, some way relate film to what's going on in the cars. There's all sorts of ideas how to bring those. There's a million stories, and everybody's story is perfect, really. They're all so good.
Kind of amazing. You had those weird speakers that, you couldn't ever hear worth a shit, that were always just, no matter what great movie you were watching, the soundtrack always sucked in a drive-in. But I don't know how, maybe they've made that better now. There's that drive-in in Lubbock, right? What is it?
Stars and Stripes.
Got a double screen. Have you been to it? Have y'all been to any of you?
I've been there. You do it with the radio.
You do? You do it with your phone?
They give you a particular band.
Of course you do.
It's as good as your car sound system.
You see the movie on your phone too, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
I was actually disappointed because I drove from Santa Fe to Austin in the middle of March of this year, right? The virus was nipping at my heels and things were closing behind me. And I went through Lubbock and I was going to stop and spend the night there. And one reason I wanted to was because I wanted to go to the drive-in. And they closed it that day because of the virus, which I can't figure out because we were talking about this on the review earlier. It seems like the perfect venue to go out and be entertained during this time because you're in your car, you're in your protected bubble, but they closed it.
But also you have some sense of community when you do that. It's just like those church services.
Yeah.
You see people, you're all together. Yeah.
We haven't heard from any students yet. Any student want to flip their camera on and break into the screen with a magic question or regular question or a question putting out there as an opportunity? I've got a question from the YouTube chat from Deborah Garcia. If a student doesn't break in a second. 1, 2, 3. Deborah's happy with the conversation, and she's wondering about the relationship between the archive and pop culture or mainstream or whatever that means in relation to access and moving work analysis out of the institution. And so this, I think the question about the archive and connecting to pop culture as a way to create more access outside of an institution, kind of breaking the archive out of the institution is what I think that question is.
I don't know. I found, you know, like it was a long process dealing with this archive. Andy can speak to that. He was one of the people that instigated. It was about 8 years, I think, before it was finally kind of moved. And it was difficult going through a lot of these things and trying to decide, like there's a couple, like Joe Harvey and I, our letters to each other, I think we're probably putting, they can't be read by anybody for 1,000 years, you know? So.
We're debating on 25 or 50 years.
Yeah, that's 1,000 years as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, it was like being at the same time I was kind of putting together, I was dealing with Brendan putting together a reissue of Juarez, Lubbock on Everything, and kind of dealing with those older works. My gallery, LA Louver, was putting together a retrospective kind of works over the last 50 years. And so I kind of said it was like crawling down memory lane, you know, and I was really kind of getting beat up with it. So I did do a new album, and I'm working on some new projects and stuff now. But that's one of the things that it's like, it is a living archive. That was one of the things that interested people, is that, you know, that we're not dead, you know, and so we can still basically address what some of that stuff is in there. But I know Caitlin has been, you know, she's been one of the people that have had to deal with the real nuts and bolts of just how to salvage the stuff, organize it and whatever. And I guess it's going to all go online at some point, and it's going to be available, and that's the whole point. But I liked the fact that that it is going to be out in the world, and while we're still out in the world, you know.
It'd be nice for Caitlin to talk about ideas of how that might be presented so that other people can.
Please, Caitlin, jump in.
Yeah, no, I think that we've kind of hit the nail on the head with this project in particular. This is one of the ways that we can take materials that we have in our archive and find ways to make them into performative pieces and find ways to make them accessible. Terry brought up the idea of buying a record as sort of this experience. I think one of the things that I see on a day-to-day basis getting to work with these materials is that what I call like the tactile element of getting to see these journals in person and getting to work with them firsthand and getting to interact with patrons who come in to see them. You know, that's no matter how much digitizing and all that you do, that's still the most interesting part, is bringing people in to see this and coming up with ideas such as this drive-in archive or other sorts of performative aspects that'll bring people into the archive to interact with these materials, or more on a community level to bring these materials out to people at a larger level. Because, you know, we deal with that when we have, you know, archives behind closed doors. How do you bridge the public and the private aspect of those? But that's sort of one of the things that we're excited about with this archive, is getting to figure out ways that we can bring people in and sort of new ways of looking at this material, because it's also, as Terry and Joe Harvey said, it is their archive, but it's so multifaceted when you're looking through these letters, these journals. You can't clearly demarcate Terry and Joe Harvey and all of the other figures they've touched. And that's one of the things that we're really trying to highlight as we process the collection, is how, like I said, multifaceted these aspects are, and also the way that you get to experience this evolution of ideas. And what can that mean for people outside of just, people that are going to come in the archive? What can people from all different fields learn from that? And I think that's really invaluable with the way that the Allens have conceptualized their process and the way that that's evident with these materials. So that's something that we're working on. Of course, at this point, there's a lot of the nuts and bolts of just figuring out ways to preserve these materials to make sure that they are viable for years to come. And that specifically with the AV material, specifically with the faxes that Terry mentioned, because those, we don't have a lot of time, to ensure that we preserve those for generations to come. So, but once, we get the collection processed, we get more of these things digitized, I think there's going to be a lot of ample opportunity to find ways to bridge this gap between the public outside and also our own university. So I think there's a lot to be gained from these materials from a wide variety of sources. So
I think that's super exciting, Caitlin. Thank you. And what I also really like how you open up the disciplinary connections here, that in this work, and we're talking about two people that are connected to many people, and you're kind of talking about it in a networked term. But if we think about that landed within a university, how this collection can spider out, like we're connected to architecture today, but it's connections to art, to theater, to dance, to performance, to the humanities. Its relevance is not specific to one narrow bandwidth, and that's really exciting, which also is kind of being grounded within a university context is really cool. Go, please.
Chris, I'd just like to say something. It's like, my major when I went to Tech for the short time I did was sociology. That's what I was interested in. And it's really been my work has been mostly based on interviews and presenting real people without any judgments, but really presenting stories of real people. And so that's another whole aspect of it, of the document, working with people, documenting things, writing about them, and then performing them.
Totally. That Chippy comes to mind, but with your works, there's so much material that's all grounded in that lived experience.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We're in kind of final minutes of time here, so I don't know if there's burning questions from the group that haven't come forward. This is the moment to bring them.
Well, I just wonder if the students or faculty might share some of the unique approaches that you all came up with in the studio to the Allen Archive drive-in movie theater performance space.
Good question.
Yeah, I think one thing that stuck out for our section was the idea of continuum, and that the archive is something that is a living being that we continue to access and build upon. And so a lot of the students' approaches ended up trying to either connect the archive with the theater or pull them apart, but understanding that it's a place that there's this thread of time that just keeps going, and this idea of creative spark. And so I think that's something that a lot of the students have been trying to pull out and show architecturally. And that was something that we got a lot of inspiration from.
I think one thing that Joe Harvey and I both we've never had any real prejudice about a particular area we worked in. We've always thought that everything was available. And I know that a lot of times schools can really hoard your area, you know, it's theater or it's art or it's this or that. But the thing that I think both of us have always thought it was one thing, you know, that there was no issue about. I know we did a guest artist thing in Houston at the University of Houston. We worked with art department, writing, theater, dance, you know, all of the kind of arts, music. And one of the things we did was ask, you know, take them to tour their different areas. And they had never been there. There were people that went into the set shop at the theater that had never even been in the theater. They had no, people from the art department had no concept that there were people here making these incredible elaborate sets and paintings and work. And you realized how isolated people got in their own area. I think, you know, it's a shame because all these different areas have so much to offer one another. And I've always thought, you know, you read a book, you know, about, and you hear some great quote by an architect or by a musician or by a painter. And whatever aspect of making things you partake in, that's applicable. Those great quotes, or you can just shift it to, you know, to whatever it is that you do. So I think there is a kinship that we've always, you know, just I think instinctively dealt with, and part of it's just becoming from. You know, we're so fortunate to be in LA during the 60s when everything was just kind of collapsing. All the isms and so forth were collapsing and things were merging with one another, whatever. And I think that's where it came from. We came from that kind of an environment where that everything was available. And I think that's in the archives.
I think that's the idea that it's all one thing and that we're all interconnected is a wonderful place to put a bow on this. And I want to thank you, Terry, and Joe Harvey, and everybody else that's joined in the room for this conversation. It's super cool on many levels. We all have go back into reviewing the second half of work this afternoon. So we're only midway through our day, but I really appreciate all the energy, interest, and effort in bringing this together. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so it's time to jump back into the studios, people, and get back to reviews. So we'll see you there.
Have a nice sanitization.
Thanks so much for being here.
Bye. Yeah.
Thank you all.
I know.
Bye.
Thank
you.
Should we
Terry.
click off now?
Terry and Joe Harvey, thank you so much. I'll cycle back with
Okay,
you
so
all.
should we just click off?
Yeah, you're good to click off, and I mean, if you're curious to see some of the projects, you can pop into the other sessions. But also, if you want to take a nap, I totally get it. It was super great.
Today is food day. We have to go.
Sure.
We have to go curbside today.
You got to go hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.
Will do.